My husband demanded half of my $35 million inheritance for his struggling mother. When I found the lockbox hidden in his office, everything suddenly made sense. Watch till the end. Subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The number stared back at me from the crisp official document, blurring slightly as my eyes filled with tears. $35,487,629.08. I blinked, sure that I was hallucinating. Nobody in my family had ever had this kind of money, not even close. I read the letter again, my hands trembling as I held the paper. As the sole beneficiary named in the last will and testament of Richard Harlow, Miss Emma Carter is hereby entitled to the entirety of the estate valued at $35,487,629.08. Uncle Richard. My mother's eccentric brother who had moved away decades ago, who sent odd postcards from exotic locations, who visited maybe once every few years with strange gifts and even stranger stories. The uncle everyone in the family had called delusional whenever he talked about his business ventures. I hadn't even known he was sick. The letter explained he had died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks ago at his estate in Switzerland. Estate. The word felt foreign. Uncle Richard had an estate. And now, inexplicably, everything he owned belonged to me. Emma, who was at the door? My husband James appeared in the doorway of our modest kitchen, his eyebrows furrowed in concern. I'd been standing frozen in the same spot since the courier had delivered the envelope 10 minutes ago. "It's from a law firm," I whispered, still staring at the number. "It's about Uncle Richard. He's dead." James moved closer, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry. I know you were fond of him." I nodded, unable to form words, and simply handed him the letter. I watched his face as he read, saw his eyes widen, his mouth drop open slightly, and then that quick, almost imperceptible change in his expression. Something calculating flickered behind his eyes before he masked it with an appropriate look of shock. $35 million, he finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. "This has to be a mistake." "That's what I thought," I said. "But the letter says they've been trying to locate me for weeks. There's a whole packet of documents. Death certificate, will, estate inventory." "It's real, James. You're rich," he said, and there was something in his tone I couldn't quite identify. "We're rich." I took the letter back from him, folding it carefully and returning it to the envelope. "I need to process this. I think I'm in shock." James nodded, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Of course. Take your time." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd noticed over our 8 years of marriage. Wow, this changes everything, doesn't it?" I wasn't sure how to respond. Did it change everything? I didn't feel any different. Uncle Richard was dead, which made me sad, but the money felt abstract, unreal. I was still the same person I had been this morning, wasn't I? "I think I need some air," I said, grabbing my jacket from the hook by the door. "I'm going to take a walk." James looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead just nodded. "Sure, that makes sense. Take all the time you need." As I stepped outside our small suburban home and breathed in the cool autumn air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted between us in those few minutes. Something that had nothing to do with my inheritance, and everything to do with the look I'd seen flash across my husband's face. I just didn't know then how right I was. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings with attorneys, financial advisors, and estate planners. I learned more about trusts, investments, and tax implications than I ever wanted to know. The money was real, very real, and now it was officially mine. James accompanied me to most of these meetings, asking questions I hadn't thought to ask, taking notes, and generally being supportive. But there was an underlying energy to him now, a barely contained excitement that sometimes bordered on impatience. "Have you thought about what you want to do with it?" he asked one night as we lay in bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating his eager expression. "The money, I mean," I sighed, turning to face him. "Honestly, I'm still processing it all. I don't want to rush into anything." Of course, he agreed quickly. "No rush, but it doesn't hurt to dream a little, right?" "I mean, we could buy a new house, something bigger in a better neighborhood, maybe a vacation property too, and we could both quit our jobs." I frowned. I like my job. I was a kindergarten teacher, had been for the past 10 years. The thought of leaving my students made my heart ache. Well, sure, but you wouldn't have to deal with all the stress and the demanding parents and the low pay. You could do something else, or nothing at all. Maybe, I said noncommittally. I just don't want this money to change who we are, you know? James propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. But that's just it, Em. It already has changed things. We're not the same struggling middle-class couple anymore. We're multimillionaires. We should embrace that. I didn't respond immediately, unsure how to articulate the unease I was feeling. After a moment, I simply said, I just need time. James nodded, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He leaned down and kissed me on the forehead. Whatever you need, I'm here for you, you know that. I know, I said, but as he turned off the lamp and settled into sleep, I found myself staring into the darkness, wondering why his reassurance felt hollow. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. James was in the kitchen, humming as he flipped pancakes, something he hadn't done in years. Morning, I said, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. What's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to make breakfast for my beautiful wife? He asked, giving me a quick kiss. I laughed. I guess not, it's just been a while. Well, I've been thinking about our conversation last night, he said, sliding a plate of pancakes in front of me. And you're right, we shouldn't rush anything. This is your inheritance, and you should take all the time you need to decide what to do with it. Relief washed over me. Thank you for understanding. Of course. He sat down across from me with his own plate. But I did have one small idea I wanted to run by you. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. My mom's birthday is coming up next month, he began, his tone casual. And you know she's been struggling since Dad died. Her house needs a lot of repairs, her car is on its last legs, and she's still working that awful job at the department store even though her arthritis is getting worse. I nodded slowly. I did know all this. James's mother, Deanne, had been widowed 3 years ago. Her husband hadn't left much, and she'd been getting by on a combination of her part-time job and Social Security. I was thinking, James continued, maybe we could give her a little something from the inheritance. Just enough to fix up her house, buy a reliable car, maybe set up a small retirement fund so she doesn't have to keep working. I considered this. Deanne and I had always had a complicated relationship. She wasn't overtly hostile, but there was always a certain coolness to our interactions, a subtle implication that I wasn't quite good enough for her son. Still, she was James's mother, and she was genuinely struggling. I think that's reasonable, I said slowly. How much were you thinking? James hesitated, poking at his pancakes. Well, I was doing some calculations. To really make a difference, to completely change her situation, I think we should give her about half. Half of what? I asked, confused. Half of the inheritance. I stared at him, sure I had misheard. Half of $35 million. You want to give your mother $17 million. James nodded, his expression earnest. Think about it, Em. It's more than enough to change her life completely, and we'd still have the other half, which is more money than we ever dreamed of having. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, but it wasn't from humor. It was shock, disbelief. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, he said, his tone hardening slightly. Why not? It's not like you earned this money. It was a random windfall from an uncle you barely knew. His words stung. That's not fair. Uncle Richard and I might not have been close in terms of physical distance, but we kept in touch. He sent me letters and emails. We had a relationship, and he chose to leave his money to me, not to my mother or my siblings or anyone else, just me. And now it's your money, James said, his voice rising slightly. Which means you get to decide what to do with it, and I'm asking you, as your husband, to share it with my mother. I pushed my plate away, my appetite gone. James, I'm not opposed to helping your mother, but half, that's excessive. We could give her $1 million and it would completely transform her life. We could set up a trust to pay for all her expenses and still have plenty left over. $1 million isn't enough, he insisted. She deserves more. More than $1 million. I was incredulous. Why? Because she's your mother. What about my mother? Should I give her half too, and then what would we have left? That's different, James said dismissively. Your parents are fine. They have their retirement savings, their house is paid off, they have each other. My mom has nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I understand you want to take care of your mother, and I respect that, but half of my inheritance is too much. I'm sorry, but that's my final answer. James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I thought you would understand. I thought you would want to share this blessing with my family, but I guess I was wrong. James, I called after him as he stormed out of the kitchen, but he didn't turn around. A moment later, I heard the front door slam. I sat there among the remains of our breakfast, a hollow feeling in my chest. This wasn't about generosity or family obligation. There was something else going on here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Why was James so fixated on giving his mother such an enormous sum? And why did I have the sinking feeling that this wasn't the end of the discussion, but just the beginning? James didn't come home that night, or the next. He sent me a text saying he was staying with a friend and needed space to think. I gave him that space, though my mind was racing with questions and concerns. In his absence, I decided to make an appointment with Mr. Patterson, the estate attorney who had been handling Uncle Richard's affairs. Perhaps he could offer some perspective on the situation. Mrs. Carter, he greeted me warmly as I entered his downtown office. How are you adjusting to your new circumstances? That's actually why I'm here, I admitted, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. I'm finding that money can complicate relationships in ways I never anticipated. Ah, he nodded sagely. Let me guess, friends and family coming out of the woodwork with their hands out. Not exactly. It's my husband. He wants me to give half of the inheritance to his mother. Mr. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. Half, as in $17 million. Yes, I confirmed, relieved that someone else found the request as outrageous as I did. He says it's because she's struggling financially since his father died, but the amount seems excessive. It certainly is, Mr. Patterson agreed. Mrs. Carter, may I speak frankly? Please do. In my 40 years of practice, I've seen how sudden wealth can bring out unexpected behaviors in those closest to the beneficiary. Your husband's request raises some red flags for me. I leaned forward. What kind of red flags? Well, for one, the amount is disproportionate to the stated need. If his mother needs financial assistance, there are many ways to provide that without handing over half your inheritance. Second, the timing is concerning. Has your husband shown this level of financial concern for his mother before the inheritance came into the picture? I thought about it. James had always been attentive to his mother, calling her regularly and visiting when he could. We'd given her money occasionally when things were tight, usually a few $100s here and there, what we could afford on our modest salaries. But he'd never suggested anything on this scale, never even hinted that he thought we should be doing more. No, I admitted. This seems to have come out of nowhere. Mr. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Carter, I don't want to alarm you, but I've seen situations like this before. Sometimes when large sums of money are involved, people can develop a sense of entitlement, even to funds that aren't legally theirs. Are you suggesting James is trying to take advantage of me? I'm suggesting that you proceed with caution. This is your inheritance, not your husband's. While marriage certainly involves sharing, there's sharing and then there's, well, what your husband is proposing. I left Mr. Patterson's office with a lot to think about. As I drove home, I found myself reflecting on my marriage in a way I hadn't before. James and I had always been a team. We met in college, got married after graduation, and built our life together step by step. We'd weathered financial struggles, career disappointments, and the heartbreak of infertility together. Through it all, I'd never doubted his love or his commitment to our partnership. But now, with $35 million in the equation, I was seeing a side of him I'd never known existed. And it wasn't just the request itself that bothered me, it was his reaction to my refusal. The cold anger, the silent treatment, the abandonment, that wasn't the James I knew and loved. When I pulled into our driveway, I noticed James's car was back. My heart raced as I entered the house, unsure what mood I would find him in. He was sitting in the living room, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. "Where have you been?" he asked. "I had a meeting with Mr. Patterson, the estate attorney." I set my purse down and sat across from him. I wanted to get his professional opinion. On what? On giving your mother half of my inheritance. James's jaw tightened. And what did he say? He thought it was excessive and concerning. I held James's gaze, and so do I. Of course he did, James scoffed. He's your lawyer. He's paid to tell you what you want to hear. That's not fair, and you know it. I took a deep breath. James, can we talk about what's really going on here? Because this doesn't feel like it's just about helping your mother. For a moment, I thought he might continue to be defensive, but then something in his expression shifted. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking tired. You're right, he admitted. It's not just about Mom. Then what is it about? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, almost wistful. Do you remember when we first met? How we used to talk about all the things we would do if we ever had money. The places we'd travel, the house we'd build, the charity we'd start. I nodded. Those late-night conversations in our dorm rooms seemed like a lifetime ago. I never thought we'd actually have the chance to do any of it, he continued. I resigned myself to a life of financial struggle, of always having to count pennies and worry about the future. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, you're handed this fortune, and it doesn't seem fair. Fair, I repeated, confused. Yeah, fair. He looked at me directly now. You didn't earn this money, Emma. You just happened to have an uncle who got rich and died. That's it. That's the only reason you now have $35 million. It's dumb luck. I felt a stab of hurt at his words. So what? You think because I didn't earn it, I don't deserve to decide what happens to it? I'm your husband, he said, as if that explained everything. We're supposed to be partners, equals, but now you're the rich one and I'm just... What? The guy who happened to marry someone who inherited a fortune? Where does that leave me? Understanding dawned slowly. This wasn't about his mother at all. This was about him feeling insecure, feeling like the balance of power in our relationship had shifted. James, I said softly, the money doesn't change who we are to each other. We're still partners. We're still equals. Are we? He challenged. Because it doesn't feel that way when you can unilaterally decide not to help my mother. That's not what happened, I protested. I said I was willing to help her, just not to the tune of $17 million. That's a reasonable boundary. Is it? He leaned forward. Or is it you asserting control because now you have all the financial power? I felt a flash of anger. That's not fair. I'm trying to be responsible with this inheritance, to make decisions that make sense for our future. Giving away half of it right off the bat doesn't make sense, no matter who it's going to. It makes sense to me, he insisted. Mom took care of me my whole life. She sacrificed everything for me. Now I have a chance to take care of her, to give her the life she deserves, and you're standing in the way. I'm not standing in the way, I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. I'm suggesting alternatives. We could set up a trust for her. We could buy her a new house outright in a nicer area. We could ensure she has the best health care, a comfortable retirement. All of that would cost a fraction of what you're asking for. But she would still have to live by your rules, he argued. If we just give her the money, she can do whatever she wants with it. She would have true freedom. I stared at him, feeling like I was seeing a stranger. Do you hear yourself? You're talking about giving your mother enough money to live like a queen for the rest of her life, with no accountability, no structure, nothing. Do you really think that's what's best for her? I think it's not your decision to make, he said coldly. But it is, I countered. This is my inheritance, James. My uncle left it to me, not to us. I'm happy to share it with you to build our future together with it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to hand over half of it to your mother on a whim. It's not a whim, he snapped. I've thought about this carefully. For how long? I asked. Because we only found out about the inheritance 3 weeks ago. How long have you been planning this? He didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. James, I said, feeling suddenly weary, I think we need some space to figure this out. This conversation isn't productive right now. Fine, he said, standing up. I'll go stay with Mom for a few days. Maybe that will help you remember who really matters in this family. As he stormed out for the second time in as many days, I felt a deep sadness settle over me. Was this what money did to people? Turn love into calculation, partnership into power struggles. Or had these issues always been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right catalyst to bring them to light? I didn't know, but I was determined to find out. The next day, I made a decision. If James was going to use his mother as the justification for his demands, I needed to understand exactly what her situation was. not through his increasingly dramatic descriptions, but firsthand. I drove to Deanne's modest ranch-style house in the older part of town. I hadn't called ahead, partly because I wanted to catch her in an unguarded moment, and partly because I was afraid she would refuse to see me. The door opened after my second knock, revealing Deanne in jeans and a faded sweater. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there was a wariness in her eyes as she recognized me. "Emma," she said, not bothering to hide her surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," I said politely. "I was wondering if we could talk." She hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let me in. "James isn't here right now. He went to the store." "Actually, I came to see you," I clarified, following her into the small living room. It was cluttered but clean, with worn furniture and faded family photos on the walls. Deanne gestured for me to sit on the couch while she took the recliner opposite. "What can I do for you?" I decided to be direct. "Has James talked to you about my inheritance?" A flicker of something, possibly guilt, crossed her face. "He mentioned that you'd come into some money, yes. Did he mention that he wants me to give you half of it?" Now her eyes widened in genuine shock. "Half of how much?" $35 million. Deanne's mouth fell open. 30? You inherited $35 million. I nodded, watching her carefully. "And James wants me to give you 17 million of it." She blinked rapidly, as if trying to process this information. "I had no idea it was that much. He just said you'd inherited a significant amount from your uncle and that you were being, in his words, stingy about sharing it." That stung, but I pushed past it. "So he didn't tell you he was asking for half for you?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "He mentioned wanting to help me out, maybe buy me a new car or pay off my mortgage, but nothing like $17 million. She let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "That's crazy." I felt a wave of relief. At least James hadn't been poisoning his mother against me with false promises. "I agree, but he's insistent. He says you need it, that you've struggled since your husband died, and that I'm being selfish for not agreeing." Deanne leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Emma, can I be honest with you? Please." "I've never been the mother-in-law you deserved," she said quietly. "I was hard on you when you and James first got together. I didn't think you were good enough for him." This frank admission surprised me. Deanne had never been this open before. "But over the years," she continued, "I've seen how you support him, how you love him. You're a good wife to my son, and I've come to respect that, even if I haven't always shown it." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "As for my financial situation," she went on, "yes, things have been tight since Gerald died. The house needs work, my car is unreliable, and working at my age isn't easy, but I'm not destitute. I'm managing. And I certainly don't need or expect $17 million from you." "But James seems to think you do," I said, still puzzled by his insistence. Deanne sighed, looking suddenly tired. "Emma, there's something you should know about James, something I've never told you because I hoped, he had outgrown it." I leaned forward, suddenly alert. "What is it?" "James has always had issues with money. Even as a child, he was obsessed with it, not in a saving way, but in a spending way. He wanted the best toys, the nicest clothes, the latest gadgets. Gerald and I weren't wealthy, but we tried to give him what we could. Maybe we overindulged him, I don't know." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "As he got older, it got worse. He maxed out his first credit card within a month of getting it. He took out student loans not just for tuition, but for spring break trips and a fancy car. By the time he graduated college, he was in serious debt." This was news to me. James had told me he had student loans when we first got married, but he'd made it sound like they were manageable, just the normal burden most graduates carry. We'd paid them off over the first few years of our marriage, living frugally to do so. "Did he ever tell you about the gambling?" Deanne asked quietly. I felt a cold shock run through me. "Gambling? No, never." She nodded as if she'd expected this. "It started in college. Small bets on sports games at first, then online poker, then casinos. By the time Gerald and I found out, he was in deep. We remortgaged our house to pay off his debts." My mind was reeling. "When was this?" "The worst of it was right before he met you," Deanne said. "We thought he'd hit rock bottom. He promised to get help, and I believe he meant it. And then he met you, and it seemed like he had turned a corner. You were so steady, so sensible about money, I thought maybe you were exactly what he needed." And was he? I asked, hardly daring to breathe. Did he get help? Did he stop gambling? Deanne's expression was pained. I thought so, I hoped so. But about a year ago, he came to me asking for money, a lot of money. He said it was for a business investment, but he was evasive about the details. I didn't have it to give, and he was angry, more angry than the situation warranted. My mind flashed back to about a year ago. James had been moody, distant for a few weeks. When I asked what was wrong, he said he was stressed about work. Then, seemingly overnight, his mood improved. He said his work situation had resolved itself. I hadn't questioned it further, relieved that my cheerful, loving husband was back. "Deanne," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt inside, "do you think James has started gambling again?" She met my eyes directly. "I don't know for certain, but I've been worried enough that I've been keeping an eye on my credit reports, just in case." The implications were staggering. If James had relapsed into gambling, if he had accumulated debts again, it would explain his desperate grab for half of my inheritance. It would explain the urgency, the anger, the manipulation. "Thank you for being honest with me," I said, standing up. "I need to go now. I have a lot to think about." Deanne rose as well, surprising me by pulling me into a brief hug. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you years ago. I just wanted to believe he had changed." As I drove home, my mind was spinning with questions. If what Deanne had told me was true, if James had a gambling addiction that he had hidden from me our entire relationship, what else might he be hiding? How could I have been so blind? I needed answers, and I knew where to start looking. When I got home, I went straight to James's office, a small room off the living room that he had claimed as his own when we bought the house. He kept it locked when he wasn't using it, claiming he needed privacy for work calls. I'd always respected that boundary, never questioning it. Now, though, I had questions that needed answers, and I had a feeling those answers might be behind that locked door. I didn't have a key, but I remembered that when we first moved in, the previous owners had left a set of spare keys in the kitchen drawer. I rummaged through until I found them, and sure enough, one of them fit the office door. The room was neater than I expected, with a simple desk, computer, and filing cabinet. I started with the desk drawers, finding nothing but office supplies and old receipts. The filing cabinet was next, containing mostly household files, tax returns, and warranties for appliances. I was beginning to think I was on a wild goose chase when I noticed a small metal lockbox tucked behind the filing cabinet. It was the kind you might use to store important documents or valuables with a simple key lock. I didn't have the key, but I did have determination. After a bit of searching, I found a small screwdriver in James's desk drawer. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but I needed to know the truth. I managed to pry the lockbox open, feeling a pang of guilt that was quickly overshadowed by shock at what I found inside. Credit card statements, dozens of them, for cards I never knew existed. As I flipped through them, my heart sank. The balances were astronomical. $15,000 on one, $22,000 on another, $18,500 on a third, all maxed out or nearly so, with minimum payments barely covering the interest. But it was what I found beneath the credit card statements that truly made my blood run cold. Loan documents from several different lenders, all high interest, all with urgent payment notices. And most damning of all, a handwritten note on official letterhead, "Final notice, payment of $85,000 due by end of month or collection proceedings will commence. We've been patient, James, but our patience has its limits." The note wasn't signed with a name, just an ominous M. It didn't sound like any legitimate lender I'd ever heard of. It sounded like a loan shark. I sat back on my heels, the evidence of my husband's secret life spread out around me. James wasn't just in debt. He was in dangerous debt, the kind that people don't walk away from, and he had hidden it from me completely. Suddenly, his desperate push for half of my inheritance made perfect, terrible sense. He didn't want it for his mother. He wanted it for himself, to pay off debts that could potentially put him, and by extension me, in real danger. Just as this realization was sinking in, I heard the front door open. "Emma, are you home?" James. He was back. Quickly, I gathered the papers, shoving them back into the lockbox. I managed to replace it behind the filing cabinet just as I heard his footsteps approaching the office. Emma, what are you doing in here? I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Looking for our tax returns from last year, I lied smoothly. I have a meeting with a financial advisor tomorrow, and she asked me to bring them. His posture relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained wary. You could have just asked me, I would have found them for you. You weren't home, I pointed out, and I didn't want to bother you after our argument. He seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. Did you find them? Yes, I said, holding up a folder I had grabbed from the filing cabinet. All set. Good. He hesitated, then said, Look, Emma, about the other day, I shouldn't have walked out like that. It's just, this whole inheritance situation has me stressed. I want what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone, or what's best for you, I thought, but kept my expression neutral. I understand. It's a lot to process. So have you thought more about what we discussed? About helping my mother? The fact that he was bringing this up again, knowing what I now knew, made my stomach turn. But I forced myself to stay calm. I needed time to figure out my next move. I have, I said carefully. And I think you're right that we should help her, but I want to do it in a way that makes sense. I was thinking we could set up a trust for her, something that would cover all her needs but also protect the assets. His expression darkened slightly. A trust, that's so. Controlling, why can't we just give her the money directly? Because you'd find a way to get your hands on it, I thought. But aloud, I said, trusts are standard practice with large sums of money. It's not about control, it's about smart financial planning. How much were you thinking of putting in this trust? He asked, his tone deceptively casual. I was thinking $2 million, I said, watching his reaction carefully. Enough to buy her a new house, a new car, cover all her medical expenses, and give her a comfortable retirement income. $2 million. He repeated, not bothering to hide his disappointment. That's it. It's $2 million, James, I said, letting a hint of exasperation show. It's an incredibly generous amount. But it's nothing compared to what you inherited, he argued. It's not even 10%. And why should it be? I challenged. Why does your mother deserve a certain percentage of my inheritance? $2 million will completely transform her life. Isn't that enough? He didn't have a good answer for that, and I could see him struggling to find a way to push for more without revealing his true motives. I suppose we could start with $2 million, he said finally, in a tone that suggested he was making a huge concession. We can always reassess later if she needs more. I nodded, relieved that he was backing down, even temporarily. That sounds reasonable. I'll talk to Mr. Patterson about setting it up. Great, James said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. I should call Mom and let her know. She'll be so grateful. I thought about my conversation with Deanne earlier that day, how genuinely shocked she had been at the idea of receiving $17 million. How she had no idea about James's request. I wondered what version of events he would tell her now. You do that, I said. I have some emails to catch up on. As James left the office, I felt a cold determination settle over me. I needed to protect myself, my inheritance, and ironically, even Deanne from whatever trouble James had gotten himself into. The next morning, I had an early appointment with Mr. Patterson. I brought the folder of tax returns as a cover, but my real purpose was much more serious. Mrs. Carter, he greeted me, looking surprised when I asked his assistant if we could speak privately. What can I do for you today? I took a deep breath. I need to know how to protect my inheritance, not just financially but legally, from my husband. Mr. Patterson's expression turned grave. I see. Has the situation escalated? Yes, I said simply, and proceeded to tell him everything. The hidden debts, the suspicious loan notice, James's lies about wanting the money for his mother. By the time I finished, Mr. Patterson was taking rapid notes, his brow furrowed in concern. This is indeed serious, he said. The good news is that your inheritance is still solely in your name. The bad news is that, depending on the state laws where you live, your husband may have a claim to a portion of it as marital property. What can I do? Several things, he said, leaning forward. First, do not, under any circumstances, transfer any of the inheritance into joint accounts or property. Keep it completely separate from marital assets. I nodded. I've been careful about that so far. Good. Second, I would recommend consulting with a divorce attorney. He held up a hand when he saw my expression. Not necessarily to file for divorce immediately, but to understand your options and protections should it come to that. The word divorce hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything, I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. James and I had been together for 12 years, married for 8. We had built a life together, weathered storms together. Could I really walk away? But then I remembered the evidence of his deception, the years of lies, and I knew I had to at least consider the possibility. "I understand," I said quietly. "Third," Mr. Patterson continued, "this loan shark situation concerns me greatly. These types of lenders often resort to harassment or even violence when payments aren't made. You need to consider your physical safety." A chill ran through me. "You think I could be in danger?" "It's a possibility we can't ignore," he said gravely. "I would recommend increased home security at minimum, and you might want to consider relocating temporarily somewhere your husband doesn't know about." The idea seemed extreme, but the note I had found was clear. James owed $85,000 to someone who was running out of patience. If he couldn't pay, what would they do? And if they thought I was now the one blocking their payment, would they come after me? "I'll think about it," I promised. "One more thing," Mr. Patterson said. "Given what you've told me about your husband's gambling addiction, I'm concerned about the trust you mentioned setting up for his mother. While your intentions are generous, such a large sum might be too tempting for someone with his issues." I hadn't thought of that. "What do you suggest?" "Perhaps a more modest, immediate gift, with provisions for ongoing support that would be difficult for your husband to access or influence. We could structure it in a way that ensures the money goes directly to her needs, not through him." "That makes sense," I agreed. "I want to help Deanne, but I don't want to inadvertently fund James's addiction or debt payments." As I left Mr. Patterson's office, I felt simultaneously overwhelmed and strangely empowered. I had options. I had professional advice. I had resources. For the first time since discovering James's deception, I felt like I might be able to navigate this mess. But first, I needed to confront the truth of my marriage, a truth I had been avoiding since finding those hidden documents. Did I want to try to save it? Could it even be saved? Or was it time to accept that the foundation had been built on lies, and no amount of love or effort on my part could repair that? When I returned home, the house was empty. James had left a note saying he had gone to visit his mother, which gave me time to think and plan. I spent the afternoon making calls, consulting with a divorce attorney as Mr. Patterson had suggested, and setting up additional security for my financial accounts. By evening, I had made my decision. It wasn't an easy one, but I knew it was right. I loved the James I thought I had married, the partner I thought I had built a life with. But that man didn't exist. He never had. James returned around 8 p.m., looking relaxed and cheerful, a stark contrast to my emotional state. "Hey," he said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. Mom was thrilled about the trust. She couldn't believe we're giving her $2 million. I noted his use of "we" and "giving," as if the money was already joint property, as if the decision had been mutually made. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes about his mindset. "James," I said quietly, "we need to talk." His smile faltered. "What's wrong?" "I know about the gambling," I said, watching his face carefully. "I know about the credit cards, the loans. I know about all of it." His expression went through a rapid series of changes, from shock to denial to anger to something like resignation. He sank into a chair across from me. "How?" he asked finally. "It doesn't matter how," I replied. "What matters is that you lied to me. For our entire relationship, you've been living a double life." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I had once found endearing. "It's not as bad as you think." "Really?" I challenged. "Because what I think is that you're in debt to a loan shark for $85,000 on top of maxed-out credit cards I never knew existed. I think you were planning to use my inheritance to bail yourself out, using your mother as a smokescreen. I think you've been lying to me since the day we met." He winced at each accusation, unable to meet my eyes. "I was going to tell you. After we got the money for Mom, I was going to come clean about everything." "Were you?" I asked, skepticism clear in my voice. "Or were you going to find a way to get your hands on even more of my inheritance?" "That's not fair," he protested weakly. "None of this is fair, James," I said, my voice rising. It's not fair that you hid a gambling addiction from me for our entire marriage. It's not fair that you manipulated me, using your mother's legitimate needs as a cover for your own financial desperation. It's not fair that I'm now sitting here wondering if anything about our relationship was real." "Of course it was real," he insisted, finally looking at me. "I love you, Emma. That's always been real." The sad thing was, I believed him. In his own way, as much as he was capable of, I think James did love me. But love without honesty, without trust, that wasn't enough. Not anymore. "I've consulted with an attorney," I said, keeping my voice steady. "About the inheritance, about our marriage, about everything." His face paled. "You're not thinking of divorce." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I am." "Emma, please," he said, desperation creeping into his tone. "We can work this out. I'll get help, real help this time. I'll go to Gamblers Anonymous therapy, whatever it takes. Just please don't throw away our marriage." "I'm not the one who threw it away," I said softly. "You did that the moment you decided that lies were easier than truth." He looked stricken. "What about Mom, the trust, the 2 million? Of course, that would be his concern. Not our marriage, not my feelings, but the money. "I'm still going to help your mother," I said. "But not with a lump sum. I'll set up a more structured arrangement that ensures her needs are met without giving you access to large amounts of capital." His expression darkened. "So you're punishing her for my mistakes?" "No," I corrected firmly. "I'm protecting her from them, and protecting myself in the process." We talked, or rather argued, for hours after that. James cycled through begging, anger, bargaining, even threats. But beneath it all was a desperate man who saw his financial salvation slipping away. And that, more than anything, confirmed for me that I was making the right decision. Eventually, he accepted that I wasn't going to change my mind, at least not tonight. He agreed to stay with a friend while we figured out next steps. As he packed a bag, I felt a complex mixture of sadness, relief, and a strange kind of peace. The life I had thought I was building was gone, shattered by revelations I couldn't ignore. But perhaps that meant I was now free to build something new, something honest. 6 months later, I sat across from Deanne at a small cafe downtown. Our relationship had evolved into something I never would have expected, a genuine friendship. "The house is wonderful," she said, her eyes bright with happiness. "I still can't believe you bought it for me," I smiled. In the end, I had purchased a comfortable condo for Deanne in a nice part of town, paid off her remaining debts, and set up a monthly stipend that ensured she would never have to work again unless she wanted to. It was generous without being excessive, and more importantly, it was structured in a way that James couldn't touch. "I'm glad you like it," I said sincerely. "How's the art class going?" Deanne had discovered a passion for painting, something she had always wanted to try but never had the time or resources for. Now, with financial security and free time, she was flourishing. "Wonderful. The instructor says I have a good eye for color." She hesitated, then asked, "Have you heard from James?" I shook my head. The divorce had been finalized a month ago. James had fought it initially, then changed tactics, trying to get half of my inheritance in the settlement. When his lawyer explained that wasn't going to happen, especially given the circumstances, he had become nasty, threatening to drag my name through the mud, to tell everyone how cruel and heartless I was. In the end, though, he had settled for a fair division of our modest marital assets and a lump sum payment that I later learned was almost exactly the amount he owed to his mysterious creditor. I suspected that was not a coincidence. "No," I said, "but I heard from a mutual friend that he's moved to Las Vegas." Deanne sighed. Back to the scene of the crime. She had been devastated to learn that James had relapsed into gambling, perhaps had never truly stopped. But over time, she had come to accept that she couldn't save him from himself. None of us could. "How's the foundation coming along?" she asked, changing the subject. I brightened at this. "Wonderfully. We've already awarded our first round of grants to single parents pursuing higher education." After much thought, I had decided to use a significant portion of my inheritance to establish a foundation focused on educational opportunities for adults who, for whatever reason, had been unable to complete their education earlier in life. It felt like a fitting tribute to Uncle Richard, who had been largely self-taught and had always valued learning above all else. "I'm so proud of you," Deanne said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Not many people would have handled all of this with the grace and generosity you've shown. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sunshine streaming through the cafe window. I've learned a lot these past few months, about money, about people, about myself. And what have you learned about yourself? She asked curiously. I thought for a moment. That I'm stronger than I knew. That I can lose what I thought was the foundation of my life and still build something beautiful. That sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the greatest peace. And it was true. The journey from that moment in my kitchen, staring at the inheritance letter in disbelief, to where I sat now had been painful, confusing, and at times terrifying. But it had also been transformative. I had lost a husband, but gained clarity. I had lost a future I thought I wanted, only to create one far more meaningful. The inheritance had changed my life, but not in the way anyone, least of all James, had expected. It hadn't changed me into someone who needed expensive things or luxurious experiences. Instead, it had given me the freedom to discover who I truly was when the financial pressures and daily stresses of ordinary life were removed. And who I was, I discovered, was someone who valued honesty, kindness, and generosity. Someone who wanted to make a difference in the world. As Deanne and I finished our lunch and parted ways, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the money, though that was certainly life-changing, but for the clarity it had brought. Sometimes it takes a seismic shift to reveal the fault lines that were there all along. And sometimes, when everything falls apart, you finally see what truly matters, what was worth holding onto all along. For me, it wasn't the money or the status or even the marriage I had fought to preserve. It was my integrity, my compassion, and my capacity to help others. In the end, when James demanded we share my inheritance with his mother, I had burst out laughing not because the request was inherently absurd, but because in that moment, I saw the truth of who he was, who I was, and what our marriage had really been built on. And in that revelation, painful as it was, I found my freedom.